Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Armor Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 and one for 30, and it's your job to draw the image that you see. Lizet will be joining us today. She'll be doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow her advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Once it's finished, don't forget to post your photographs on Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everybody and welcome to another Raw Umber portrait video. Now with the new thing we're going to try out, I'm going to focus these 3 sessions on the real basics. In this case I'm going to be working on the box and how to turn the box in space in order to create a structured portrait. So let's get started. I'm using a compressed charcoal pencil. Make sure to sharpen it a little bit if you're using the same thing with some sandpaper, just to create a nice sharp point. And also I'm using a putty rubber. When you're getting one of those, make sure to get a grey one. And finally I'll be using a brush just to do a little bit of blending. And this is just a normal little acrylic brush that I got somewhere in an art shop. Okay, so those of you who've done stuff with me before will know how I will start with the box method, but for those of you who are new, I usually start by placing the figure, or the portrait in this case, on the paper. And this is completely arbitrary. This is wherever I want the person to be. But this is also going to be my true measurement. Well, first of all, she is actually at an angle, so you can see the center line going from the bottom of the chin to the top of the brow. That's at an angle, so we know that the box is at an angle, and I just fill in everything else, making sure that my lines are all 90 degrees from each other. So when you know the center line, you know the other sides of the box as well. Next, I measure and make sure that it's exactly a square, so the length is equal to the height. And this is normal on most people, but it's always good to check because some people have longer, more narrow faces, some people have wider, shorter faces, so it's always good to just have a little look. Now again, those of you who've done some drawings with me before will know what I'm doing now. I divide the face up into 3 thirds. These thirds are bottom of the chin to bottom of the nose, bottom of the nose to top of the brow, and top of the brow to forehead. And these lines are always perpendicular, again a 90-degree angle, to the center line. So you can imagine if someone's looking from the front, which we'll do in a 20-minute pose, the eyes are always horizontal versus the vertical line of that center line. And it's the same in this pose, except that she's angled a little bit. Next, I'm going to divide up the face into a front plane of the box and a side plane of the box. And the glasses are actually really good to use in this case, because you can see the rim of the glass, the top line is that sort of line that we've put in for the brow. And then you can also follow that sort of line of the side of the glass all the way to her ear. And that is the line of the side box. So you can use that for the top of the box as well as for the bottom of the box. And this way of drawing is just to make sure that you can draw a face at any angle rather than only from the front, for instance. This box method is really good if you have someone slightly looking up, as is the case in this pose. And it can be really tricky to start with, but stick with it. I think it will really help getting your faces look more structured. Okay, so like I said, that first third was the bottom of the nose and the other one was the top of the glasses or the brow line. Now, if I go to the side plane and draw a cross, that is the exact middle of that side plane. And I also know that the ear will be in between that nose line that I followed just now and that brow line, so the bottom of her glasses. And so I can place the ear just behind that cross, in between that nose line and that brow line. And for those of you who'd like to have a little bit more of an intro to this, I did do a video on the YouTube channel. So have a look at that where I speak about this box method in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I've just put in the jawline. And also if I take the midpoint of the face, that will be the bottom of the eye socket. And also roughly where the nose originates. And you can just make the nose into a triangle shape, maybe a bit of a wedge shape, some shadow underneath. For the eye sockets, what you want to imagine is that you carve into that box, so they're always diagonal and going inwards. I imagine myself being a sculptor and sort of having this block of clay and now just sculpting into it to create the planes of the face. With the bottom third, you can divide that up into another 3 sections. And these equal sections will of course be perpendicular to that line that is also the chin, the bottom of the nose and the brow. But that first line from the bottom of the nose downwards will be the middle of the lips. And that second line from the chin, the one from the chin upwards, will be the top of the chin. And most people have a wide cheek and then get more narrow towards the chin. So I'm just going to draw that in. And at this point, I'm just trying to help you create a head that sort of feels like it's a structured sort of block in space. And then we can put her exact features on top of that. But it's always good to start with a human and then sort of build from that. Because ultimately everybody has a skull and an ear and that sort of thing. So I find it really helpful to just draw from something quite generic and then going more specific as I go. Now, of course, the head's not floating in space, so we have to also draw the neck in. And for this, there's 2 really useful muscles. So from the bottom of the ear, there's this big sort of white muscle you can see quite well on her, and that's called the mastoid muscle, and it goes towards the pit of the neck. And what I do after that is I just draw the shoulders in, and it's important that they line up at the back of the neck. Okay, so that's it for the structure. I'm gonna add now her glasses on top, which is basically the same way I did on the eye sockets, but now they stick out a little bit further and also they're a little bit bigger and lower. But I keep using the symmetry that I used in the structure of the face, and I keep using straight lines, and I keep checking the angles. If you have any questions about this box method, please feel free to ask me in the comments if you're watching this live. Otherwise, I'll see you in a 20-minute post where we're going to take this technique a little bit further. Okay, so now you know about the box method and how to create a box in space. I want to talk about some common measurements and structures that we'll see in the face. So, I did last time, I'm going to start by adding the top and bottom on my page and deciding where I want the portrait to be. Now this is a straightforward shot, so it'll be a bit easier than doing a box in space. And the reason I want to show you this is because it's much easier to see all the measurements and the symmetry when somebody's looking straight at you. So I'm going to start again by placing my 3 thirds. And I always tend to work from big to small. So I've got my biggest measurement, which is the height to the bottom of the chin. And now I want to know how wide somebody is. So I'm checking to see if there's any interesting measurements I can take over. And as I measure like this, I can see that the width of her head is exactly the same as the chin to the top of the brow. And by the width of her head, I mean the width of the cheekbones, the widest point of her face. And this differs a little bit in everybody. Some people have a wider jaw or a wider forehead, but most people will have the cheekbones being the widest point. A very useful sort of thing to look at is Loomis' way of taking a skull and sort of compressing it and seeing how somebody is wider or more narrow in certain areas. I found that really helpful with likeness. And so you can imagine that this is the box, this width versus the height, that we will use as the front plane in any other box method sort of drawing. Now looking at that bottom of the nose, which is the first third, and the top of the brow, which is that upper third. If we take the exact middle of that, that will be the bottom of the eye sockets or the widest point of the cheekbone. And you can see that her sort of jaw starts coming in from that point. And what I like to do is make up an imaginary straight line and see how that line deviates from that. And of course, if that is the way on one head of the face, then it's got to be exactly the same on the other side of the face as well. Because most people are completely, well, they're not actually completely symmetrical, but it's better to make someone too symmetrical rather than a little bit slightly overstate the small changes, because portraits can very quickly look a bit weird if they're not entirely symmetrical. So I try to always emphasize the symmetry in somebody's face. And like I was saying in the first pose, we can divide that bottom third from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin into another 3 thirds, with that being the bottom of the top lip, so the middle of the lips, and the top of the chin. Now for the eyes, what I find really useful to see is how many times the eyes fit into the face. So in her case, I see her eyes fit exactly 5 times. From the corner of the eye to the other corner of the eye, I see one on the side, one where the actual eye is, one in between the eyes, another where the actual eye is, and then another one on the sides. And this is really useful because again, it helps with that symmetry, and it also helps with the lightness a lot, because some people have wider sort of brow areas and some people have of course less wide brow areas. Now looking at the sides of the nose, I can line that up vertically. So going from the corners of her eyes, I can see that her nostrils are roughly at the same vertical measurements. And all these sort of measurements help a lot with likeness, because some people have wider noses, some people have more narrow noses, and it helps to see how this actually relates. And going back to horizontal measurements, you can see that her chin goes further in, and it sort of lines up horizontally with that halfway point between the top of the chin and the bottom of the chin. So again, always looking for symmetry. Try to bring that in the same place on both sides. And you can see the flat bit of her chin, the block of her chin, lines up exactly with the sides of her nose as well. And I continue using these vertical measurements. And for instance, I see that the corners of her mouth line up with roughly halfway her eyes. So I'm going to place the corners of her mouth there. And these sort of measurements are just so useful, whatever angle you've got, because then you can remember, oh, this person has a wider than average nose, and this person has a more narrow than average mouth. And that's really, really useful. Now I'm putting in the angles of the forehead using the same way that I used for the chin. And in her case, she's wearing a headband, and I'm just sort of checking how much space is from that headband to the top of her hair. And I think that sort of lines up with the bottom of her chin, so I'm just going to add that in. And like we said in the last pose, the ears roughly line up with the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the brow. Now in this case she's looking up slightly, so her ears are slightly lower, but they're still both at the same place on both sides of her face. And now I just add the rest of her headband and her hair, and I constantly try to think, how does this angle sort of differ from the vertical or the horizontal, and how far is it from a certain measurement? Does it line up with certain things vertically or horizontally? And that just helps so much with accuracy if you can just sort of let go of the idea of a face and just look at lines that have certain endpoints, beginnings, and also have certain angles. And everyone can draw a triangle or a square. It's a lot easier if you manage to break up the face into simple shapes like that, rather than having to draw the perfect eye in the first go. Now, first you can just draw a little square, and then later break that down further and further until you finally have an eye. And this process can be a little bit unsettling because it doesn't look like much at the start. As you can see, it's just a bunch of very straight lines at the moment. But as you break it down further and further, it will start looking more and more like a face. And it's actually more like what you see in real life. For instance, when you see something half in shadow, our brains are actually sort of calibrated to understand that that's actually a face. But what we really just see, and this is something the Impressionists did very well, is just shapes of light and shadow falling on our retina and us interpreting this into a face. Anyway, I'll stop going on about it. Just try it and see if you find it useful. Okay, so now I'm going to put in the glasses. So again, looking for symmetry, trying to measure where those lines are. So going from the bottom of our glasses first, and then seeing how that V, where it sits on the nose, sort of relates to the vertical. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start shading, and the shading process is exactly the same as what we just did before, but now instead of putting lines down, you're putting down blocks of darkness. So for instance, on the side of her face, you can see it sort of follows about halfway to the corner of her mouth. So I'm just going to make that dark and straight. And while you're shading, just keep in mind the angles of it. Try not to look into the shadow too much. We're just trying to figure out what bits are turning away and what bits are turning towards us, and those will be the lighter areas. And try to keep it very, very simple for yourself. And I like to keep thinking in these big blocks. And especially when you start shading, you can see stuff starting to sort of emerge. Now, what I like to do, and this is completely optional, is I like to go in with my little brush and just sort of shade and flatten my shadows in. You can also do this with your finger or a Q-tip or a piece of tissue. All kinds of blending tools. Everyone has their own preference, and I like to use the brush. And now when I've shaded everything in, I can start removing with my rubber in order to get the glasses sort of to come out properly. And that will be the end of the 20-minute pose. So basically it's the same thing we did in the 10-minute pose, which is using big blocks to construct a face. And now in the 30-minute pose, what we'll start doing is combine these two. So we're going to use that big block, sort of like sculptural way of drawing that we used in the 10-minute pose, and we're going to add to that the measurements and the structure of the face that we've explored in this 20-minute pose. Okay, so here we are for the final pose, and as you can see, she's sort of turning away from us with a little bit of her face in shadow. So let's start the same way that we did in the 20-minute pose by finding the sort of center line as well as where the person is on the page. And remember that when something is attached to the center line, so the brow and the chin and the bottom of the nose will be at a 90-degree angle, so completely perpendicular to that center line. And you can see that really well at the top rim of her glasses. And because it is a box, make sure that also the back of the head corresponds with that center line and should be at the same angle. Now measuring again, looking at the side of her glasses and how many times that would fit in the complete box, it seems like it should be about 1/3. So 2/3 will be the side plane of her head and 1/3 will be the front plane. And next I can put in the 3/3, following that line perpendicular to the front plane and then also perpendicular to the side plane. Drawing in the cross and placing the ear just behind it, making sure that you're not angling it straight, but actually the ear is usually tilted a little bit backwards. Next I can put in that wedge shape of the nose, knowing that the bottom of the nose will be the bottom of that 1/3. And the bottom of the eye sockets going inwards. And I can also use the bottom of the glass for this. Figuring out the 3/3 of the bottom of the face, so the mouth to the chin. And you can see on her the chin sort of sticks out a little bit more than her lips, so I've put that in. And then I follow that line and sort of make that diagonal to the ear for the jawline. And when I look at the exact middle of the vertical shape, so the middle of her head where her eyes will be, that will also be the back of her head. So that's where sort of the skull sort of ends. When I know where that is, I know where her headband will be. and also her neck. And the glasses are really helpful because you can find exactly where that box is. So just following that sort of side of her glasses towards the front plane of her glasses. And then I can start shading. So finding the blocks of darkness, following where I see them sort of appear. And here I've sort of blended those with my brush. And I'm gonna add something to the shading that I didn't really quite add in the 20-minute pose, and that is hard and soft edges. So for instance on our headband, you can see on the sides, it's actually quite sharp. But at the bottom, it sort of turns round towards the back of her head. And that's called a form shadow. It means that the form is turning away from the light and therefore softly turns into shadow. And the rounder the form, the softer the shading should be. And I like to use my brush for this. I sort of like blend it back and forth into the paper to get a nice soft shade. But not all shadows are soft, and actually there are places where they're actually quite hard. So one of those places will be where there's a cast shadow. So a shadow being cast on a different form. So for instance, with her cheek on the side there, you can see that it's sort of round where she laughs, but then that cheek casts a shadow on her lip area, and that can be really nice and sharp. Another place where you can find sharp edges is where there's overlap. So for instance, her neck is sticking out in front of the background. So that's why I'm going to make it nice and sharp as well. And you can start finding these sharp edges all along the whole face. So for instance, back of her neck and the back of her ear, there's a shadow being cast by the headband. And the bottom of her nose, as well as a little bit of the front of her nose, is sticking out in front of, is overlapping the background. And see if you can find other places that also have this sharp quality to the edge between light and shade. Okay, so hopefully you found some nice sharp edges, and now I'm going to talk about the opposite of sharp edge, and that is soft edges. So for instance, on our cheek, which I spoke about just before, you can also see that at the opposite side of that hard cast shadow, you can see that the cheek sort of turns round softly. And even if you don't see it, you know that the cheek actually doesn't suddenly turn. It's a round form. So I could start blending that, and you can see that when I do that, immediately the sharp edges also jump out more. So the same thing I can do on the bottom of her jaw. It rounds off into the shadow there. So I can just sort of softly blend that in. And having some shapes be hard and some shapes be soft makes the drawing feel exciting and like there's a lot of information there for the viewer to sort of latch on to. So what I'm going to do now is go over all my shadows and try to find at least one soft shape in every shadow that I've put down. So most shadows should have one hard shape, where there's an overlap or a cast shadow, and one soft shape. And even if you only see it a little bit, feel free to really go for it, because it just makes the drawing look a little bit more exciting. And at this point, I also like looking for smaller shapes. So I'm now going to start breaking down her glass a little bit more using the same technique I used in the 20-minute pose. And that is just cutting out with the rubber, trying to keep the symmetry, and also adding small shapes with my dark shadows. But mostly I'm going to be using the rubber. Now on the far away side, it's actually the opposite. So the rim of the glass aren't actually light, they're darker than the inside of the glass. So I'm just going to do a little switcheroo and make the outside of the glasses dark and the actual glass of the glasses lighter. So that's it for the 30-minute pose. Just for the last bit of time, just for fun, just for me. She's got such a cool headband and sort of color scheme going on, so I'm gonna add a little bit of a sanguine pastel just in the red areas, and this is optional. It's just because I felt like doing some color. And I hope in the meantime that you've enjoyed it and you feel like you've learned something. Feel free to have a look at my bark videos on the subscription page if you'd like to have a little bit more of an in-depth look on how to start as well as finish a drawing. And don't forget to post your stuff on Instagram using the hashtag #RawUmberLife.
Thank you for taking part. I'd like to thank Lizet for joining us today as well. Don't forget to photograph your work, post them on Instagram and hashtag them with #raw_live. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session on Wednesday evenings at 8 p.m. and a portrait drawing session on Sundays at 2 p.m. You can see our website for more details.